There were proposals that the central government, under the Articles, be given the power to maybe have a 5% tariff or something. Never got anywhere. One state or other would stand in the way. So it had no power to tax and no power to have trade policy, no trade policy, no tariffs by the central government. 12 days after the Articles of Confederation take effect, James Madison is looking for ways to bulk up the power of the central government. 12 days, according to his biographer, Ralph Ketchum. Looking for ways. Now, how can we interpret? He didn't have much to work with. You read the articles sometimes. There's not a lot there to work with. Apparently, they were going to try to use the treaty power to do it. You know, you enter in a treaty with somebody and say, okay, under the treaty, we have to do this thing. I mean, they were cooking up all kinds of ideas. You know, the growth, what Jefferson say about liberty yielding and government growing? Less than 2 weeks into the article, a period of the articles, Madison, and you shouldn't be surprised it was Madison, but you will be because of Madison's reputation, is looking for ways to beef up the power of the government. Okay, well, let me give you one indication regarding this struggle between the Articles, the people that wanted to keep the Articles. The Articles, by the way, created much too much government for my taste, but you know, I'd go back to it. And the people that wanted the power of the states wanted much more state government than I was on. But you know, I'd take that today. Okay, I'll take it. Second best. So the fight was recreated between the radicals and the conservatives over whether we keep the Articles or whether we need some new plan. To give one indication, it's erroneously believed that the driving force behind the Constitution was the determination to create a free trade zone among the states. Okay, everybody's heard this, right? The whole thing boils down to we want a free trade zone of the 13 states. Well, that's what the Commerce Clause allegedly was to address, right? To knock down the widespread trade barriers between the states. But there are several problems with this thesis. First, the United States was already a free trade zone, with the exception of a rare restriction on European goods passing across from one state to another. But as far as stuff being made in one state, being sold in another state, that was not an issue. Second, in arguing for ratification of the Constitution in the Federalist Papers, Alexander Hamilton, you can boo here, complained that tariffs were too low, not too high. He argues in Federalist 12, I'll read you the quote. Quote, "It is therefore evident that one national government would be able, at much less expense, to extend the duties on imports beyond comparison further than would be practicable to the states separately or to any partial confederacies. Hitherto, I believe it may be safely asserted that these duties have not, upon an average, exceeded in any state 3%. There seems to be nothing to hinder their being increased in this country to at least treble their present amount." He's complaining that tariffs are too low under the Articles of Confederation. And these are tariffs for European goods, not, you know, New Jersey to New York. In other words, competition among the states was keeping tariffs down, while uniting the states under a strong central government would curb that competition cartel style and permit higher tariffs. Thus, we can see the Constitution as a cartelization device. Okay, you have all these states setting their own trade policies, and it's driving tariffs down. We need to get all these states to collude in a cartel and keep it up. So, the first economic act of the first Congress under the U.S. Constitution in 1789, and as if to rub salt in the wound, it was on July 4th, a comprehensive protective tariff ranging from 5 to 10%. By the way, this tariff was called the Second Declaration of Independence. Okay, my third point on this, if you lost track, I gave the first two. Historian Calvin Johnson notes, quote, "In the original debate over adoption of the Constitution, regulation of commerce was used almost exclusively as a cover of words for specific mercantilist proposals related to deep water fishing and foreign trade. The Constitution was written before Adam Smith. Laissez-faire and free trade came to dominate economic thinking, and the Commerce Clause draws its original meaning from the preceding mercantilist tradition. Barriers on interstate commerce were not a notable issue in the original debates." He went through the debates about the Commerce Clause, and they're not talking about barriers between the states or anything but how are we going to hamper European goods coming in order to help our, it's the Hamiltonian thing. How are we going to help our homegrown industry? Okay, I need to truncate this. I know I'm pushing the time here. I wanted to leave time for, so I'll quickly summarize, not summarize, but hit two more points. One, I want to talk about land, and then economic regulation in the U.S. We tend to think that because we had a Homesteading Act in 1862, the land was basically settled by, individual farmers farming their land, sort of Lockean style, making it their own. And yet, according to a very interesting paper published a long time ago, 1935, by historian Paul Wallace Gates, that was a very tiny part of the story. Most of the land that the federal government divested itself of went to railroads, timber interests, big interests. They got the best land, they got most of the land, and they gave a lot to the states, who then, in their case, passed a lot of it on to their friends, their cronies, for different reasons. Also went to land-grant colleges and things like that. And so the best land was either given away or sold at very low prices at very desirable credit terms to well-connected people, the railroads being the most prominent but not the only ones. So he sums up by saying that the Homesteading Act was really an anomaly. It was not the rule. And then on economic intervention, we tend to think there was zero, basically zero intervention in the states and the local governments in the 19th century, from the beginning of the country up until, let's say, the Progressive era. But there's a lot of work. Jonathan R.T. Hughes wrote a very, I think, well-respected book called The Governmental Habit, which has been updated, The Governmental Habit Redux, where he says most studies of modern non-market controls consider that the relevant history extends back to the New Deal. A few go back further into the late 19th century, but in fact, the powerful and continuous habit of non-market control in our economy reaches back for centuries. Thus, during the colonial period, virtually every aspect of economic life was subject to non-market controls. I could go on with the quote, but he then documents this. I mean, at the local level and the state level, there's price controls, there's various kinds of licensing, franchise types things. It's not laissez-faire. Robert Lively in 1959 surveys a couple of dozen studies of state and local intervention and finds it rampant. Now he's happy about it. He's glad that it happened. We don't have to be glad, but it looks like that was the case. At the federal level, we know the Hamiltonians were always there, although sometimes the Jeffersonians prevailed and did some of the stuff that the Federalists had done. We have Henry Clay's American system, which Lincoln adopts. We have the Civil War, in which a lot of stuff comes in, the bank, the income tax, high tariffs. War is the health of the state, Randolph Bourne teaches, so that at least for the rest of the 19th century, you have the hangover from the war and a bulked up government. There's some retrenchment, as Higgs would teach us, but never complete retrenchment. So you have a Gilded Age in which there's a lot of political capitalism going on, a lot of political entrepreneurship. You have state legislatures in the back pockets of certain big businessmen. We have the whole Gabriel Kolko thesis about the Progressive era, where big business is behind all of the interventions, the Federal Trade Commission, the Fed, the Federal Reserve, you name it. Earlier on, the ICC, which comes in under Grover Cleveland. He let it become law. He didn't veto it. I don't think he signed it, but he didn't veto it. Cleveland's supposed to be the last great president, but why do we get the Interstate Commerce Commission, which big interests wanted? Railroads essentially wanted it. We know about Herbert Hoover. Let's go to the 20s, which is some people think of as a restoration maybe of something like laissez-faire. But you have Herbert Hoover as Secretary of Commerce, and he's working with trade associations in almost a corporatist way, which we'll then see come to fruition basically in the NRA, the National Recovery Act administration under Roosevelt. So once we're in the 20th century, I guess I don't need to convince you there's a lot of violations of laissez-faire. It's all over the place. Now you might say, well, how do we have this tremendous economic growth? Does this mean that intervention creates great wealth, even for all levels of society? And I think we can use economic theory to explain why intervention isn't going to do that. And one thing I'd point out is even though there's a lot of this intervention going on, there's subsidies and this and that, we didn't have Soviet-style planning, right? The governments weren't trying to oversee every detail of the economy, which wouldn't be possible anyway. But they weren't attempting it. So there was scope for action. There was freedom of action, and by historical standards, of course.